Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you're all having an amazing day and feeling great. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss any of our future videos. I'm excited to share this journey with you, and I hope we can have some fun together. Wishing you all good health, happiness, and positive energy. Diving deep into the ongoing situation in Ukraine and the complex web of diplomacy, military strategy, and geopolitics. We are at a crucial juncture, and the question remains, will the Trump administration use its influence to end the war, or will it continue to allow the conflict to drag on for the benefit of a few elites? As we've seen over the last year, there has been a consistent back and forth regarding a potential peace deal. But the road to a resolution remains fraught with challenges and contradictions. Let's first consider the fact that this war could have been avoided entirely. The root cause of this conflict lies in the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which Russia has repeatedly and vociferously opposed. This is a classic example of the U.S. attempting to extend its military influence right to the borders of Russia, a move that would never be tolerated by the U.S. if the roles were reversed. Imagine if Russia had tried to place its military in Mexico or Cuba during the Cold War, there would have been an immediate and fierce response from the U.S. This was a predictable outcome, yet the U.S. continued its reckless expansionism, exacerbating tensions with Russia. The war began in 2014 when the U.S. helped orchestrate the overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. The U.S. and its allies viewed his pro-Russian stance as unacceptable, and this illegal regime change laid the groundwork for the conflict we see today. Instead of fostering diplomatic engagement with Russia, the U.S. chose the path of destabilization, encouraging Ukraine to align more closely with NATO, pushing the country further into the sphere of Western influence. As the conflict escalated in 2022, Russia put forward proposals for a security arrangement that could have prevented the war. Russia's primary demand was for Ukraine to remain neutral and reject NATO membership. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, Ukrainian President Zelensky even indicated that Ukraine would accept neutrality, which could have been the breakthrough needed to end the crisis. The two sides were on the verge of a peace agreement in Istanbul in April 2022, but then the U.S. and the U.K. intervened. They told Ukraine to reject the deal and continue fighting. This decision, backed by the U.S., led to further devastation and loss of life. Now, as we stand in late 2025, reports are circulating about new peace proposals, including a 28-point plan from the U.S., a revised version from the EU, and a 19-point plan from Kiev. However, Russia is unlikely to accept any of these terms as they stand. The key issue here is NATO expansion. Despite Russia's repeated calls for a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO, the Europeans continue to push for Ukraine's eventual membership, which would only prolong the conflict. Zelensky, backed by a corrupt government and a military, exhausted by years of fighting, seems reluctant to negotiate a peace that would end the war, especially as long as there are Western powers willing to continue supplying arms and funding. The United States must play a pivotal role in ending this war. If Trump's administration is firm and realistic, the war can be brought to an end. He needs to tell the Europeans and Zelensky that this war is a lost cause. The continued expansion of NATO was a provocation that led to this conflict, and it must stop. NATO will not expand to Ukraine, and the U.S. will no longer support a proxy war against Russia. If the U.S. takes this position, the Europeans will have little choice but to fall in line. Ukraine, already exhausted by years of fighting, cannot continue the war without U.S. support. However, the situation is complicated. Trump has been a vacillating figure in this debate, often changing his stance depending on which advisor is speaking in his ear. On the one hand, there are voices in his administration pushing for peace, but on the other hand, there are neoconservative hawks like General Kellogg and Senator Lindsey Graham, who continue to advocate for a hardline stance against Russia. This inconsistency has been detrimental to efforts to bring the war to an end. The European political leadership is also a major obstacle. Leaders like Macron, Scholz, and Starmer are deeply unpopular in their own countries and have little incentive to end the war. They continue to push for policies that prolong the conflict, despite the overwhelming public desire for peace. The people of Ukraine, according to recent polls, are exhausted and want an end to the war. The Ukrainian government, however, seems more interested in continuing the fight as long as Western funding and support remain available. This creates a situation where the political elite on both sides, Ukraine and Europe, are more invested in maintaining the war than actually negotiating a peace. Looking at Russia's position, it's clear that they are not interested in occupying all of Ukraine or launching further invasions of Europe. The Russian leadership is primarily concerned with its own national security. The U.S.-backed coup in 2014 pushed Russia into a corner, and the expansion of NATO to Ukraine represented a direct threat to Russian security. This war is not about territorial conquest for Russia, but about defending itself from a perceived existential threat. The war in Ukraine is part of a broader struggle against a unipolar world dominated by the U.S., and Russia is determined to prevent further encroachment on its borders. Russia has been clear. They do not want to continue fighting, but they will not be bullied into accepting terms that threaten their national security. The U.S. and its allies, however, continue to underestimate Russia's resolve. Instead of acknowledging Russia's legitimate security concerns, the West has continued to escalate the conflict with devastating consequences for both Ukraine and the broader region. In this context, any potential peace agreement will need to address several key issues: NATO expansion, Ukraine's neutrality, and the status of the territories Russia has gained control over. The U.S. has been guilty of cheating on previous agreements, such as the Minsk Accords, which promised autonomy for the Donbas regions, but was ultimately disregarded by the U.S. and Ukraine. If a new peace agreement is reached, the West will need to prove that it can be trusted to uphold its commitments. Otherwise, the war will only continue. In conclusion, the U.S. has a critical role to play in ending this war. If Trump's administration takes a firm stance against further NATO expansion and pressures Europe and Ukraine to accept a peace deal, the war could come to an end. However, the reluctance of European leaders and the influence of neoconservative hawks in the U.S. remain major obstacles. The war in Ukraine has dragged on for far too long, and it's time for the U.S. to recognize that this conflict is a lost cause. Peace is possible, but only if the U.S. and its allies stop pursuing policies that prolong the war and start working towards a resolution that respects Russia's legitimate security concerns. Bringing you an analysis of the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. The situation is deteriorating, and once again, there are fresh proposals from the U.S. and the Kyiv regime aimed at securing a ceasefire or a peace deal. However, as usual, these proposals are utterly unrealistic and seem designed to trap Russia into accepting a deal that would be far from fair. The question remains, will the Trump administration finally recognize that the war is lost for Ukraine and push for a real resolution, or will they continue to drag their feet, allowing the Kyiv regime to collapse under the weight of the ongoing conflict? As we look at the latest reports, we see that the Kyiv regime has concocted a new 19-point peace plan following earlier proposals from the U.S. and the EU. This new plan would allow Ukraine to continue its efforts to reclaim territory in the Donbas, including regions that have already been incorporated into Russia. This, of course, is a non-starter for Russia on every level. Not only are these regions now under Russian control, but Russia will never accept any proposal that undermines its territorial integrity or security. The absurdity of these plans is clear. Even the 28-point plan proposed by the U.S. was unrealistic from the start. And now the EU has put forward its own version, which is somehow even more impractical. This is a clear example of the West trying to drag out the war, pushing proposals that they know will be rejected by Russia, but still hoping to maintain their grip on Ukraine and continue the conflict as a proxy war against Russia. But here's where things get interesting. Reports indicate that representatives from the U.S. and Kyiv have been in Geneva attempting to negotiate terms for a deal. The Ukrainians are reportedly led by some of the most corrupt figures in their government, including the Chief of Staff Yermak and former Defense Chief Rosamerov, both of whom are deeply implicated in scandal. On the U.S. side, the negotiations have been led by Dan Driscoll, the newly appointed U.S. Army Secretary, who has been described as a political loyalist to Trump. Driscoll's role is crucial because he's seen as someone who is not deeply embedded in the Washington establishment and may therefore be more open to pushing for a realistic resolution, despite the pressure from the usual neoconservative voices in Washington. However, the dynamics at play are far more complex than that. Originally, it was reported that Driscoll would deliver an ultimatum to Zelensky, pressuring him to sign a peace deal by Thanksgiving. But after strong pushback from European leaders, the deadline has now been extended. Zelensky's office even tweeted that Trump's 28-point plan was dead and extinct, signaling a victory over the USA. This underscores the fact that the Kyiv regime, despite the pressure on the battlefield and the corruption scandals, is still playing hardball and refusing to back down. The core of the issue remains the same: territorial concessions and Ukraine's potential NATO membership. These are the points that are causing the most friction in the negotiations. The Russians will never accept NATO troops in Ukraine, and they will never agree to a ceasefire that allows Ukraine to continue fighting for the territories that are now firmly under Russian control. The U.S. and its allies, however, continue to push for these terms, knowing full well that Russia will reject them outright. On the battlefield, the situation continues to favor Russia. Despite what the Western media may claim, Russia's advances in 2025 have been steady and significant. They have made gains in several key areas, including the cities of Pokrovsk and Kansk, which the Western press continues to downplay or completely ignore. The fact is, Russia's forces are advancing at a faster rate than ever, and they are doing so with superior weaponry and manpower. This is where the Western narrative begins to fall apart. The U.S. and its allies continue to inflate casualty numbers, claiming that Russia has suffered hundreds of thousands of dead, but these figures are highly misleading. The vast majority of Russian casualties are non-fatal injuries, with most soldiers recovering and returning to the front lines. In contrast, Ukraine's military is facing a much more dire situation, with desertions, defections, and an inability to replace its casualties. Western reports continually emphasize Ukrainian resistance, but this is increasingly hard to believe when you consider that Ukraine has over 400,000 deserters and a growing number of men fleeing the team country to avoid conscription. Moreover, NATO's ability to keep up with Russia's weapons production is diminishing rapidly. The Russian defense industry is outproducing NATO by a wide margin, not just in terms of artillery shells, but also tanks, drones, and other military hardware. This advantage is only growing as Russia continues to ramp up its production capabilities. The West, on the other hand, is running low on stockpiles and has little ability to replenish them in a timely manner. As the war drags on, the Ukrainian military is being whittled down, and the political crisis in Kyiv deepens. The Western media continues to pretend that Ukraine is holding strong, but the reality is that the Kyiv regime is crumbling from within. The economic situation is dire, and the political pressure is mounting as the regime struggles to maintain control. Even if NATO continues to send arms and funds, it will only delay the inevitable collapse. The fact that European countries are starting to back away from fully funding Ukraine's war effort is a sign that the war is nearing its endgame. In conclusion, no matter how many peace plans the U.S. and Europe put forward, the facts on the ground are clear. Russia is winning the war. The Kyiv regime is exhausted, both militarily and politically, and it is only a matter of time before it collapses under the weight of its own failures. The West can continue to engage in diplomatic theater, but the reality is that Russia will continue to advance, and Ukraine will be forced to accept the reality of its defeat. The U.S. and its allies may try to drag out the war, but in the end, Russia's strategic objectives will be achieved. We are witnessing a significant event in Lebanon where Hezbollah is grappling with a major loss following the assassination of one of their top commanders. This individual, who played a key role in Hezbollah's leadership during the 66-day war in 2023 to 2024, passed away in an attack. This loss is particularly devastating to Hezbollah, especially since he had just been appointed the head of their military wing. This assassination places Hezbollah in a difficult position. This is not only an issue of security breaches, but also signals the potential existence of a mole within their ranks. The fact that vital information was leaked suggests that someone at a high level may have betrayed them. Hezbollah is now faced with the dilemma of how to regain their security and protect their forces. We must note that this assassination came just days before the arrival of the Pope, a visit that would have far-reaching effects not only on Hezbollah but also on Lebanon and the broader region. If the Pope comes, it will be his first international visit since becoming the Pope, and his presence will significantly impact the region. Hezbollah will have to be extremely cautious when considering any military retaliation to avoid disrupting this important visit. However, Hezbollah cannot remain passive for too long. The assassination and the growing provocations from Israel leave them with little choice but to respond, for failure to do so would undermine their credibility with their allies and the Lebanese people. On the Lebanese government side, the president and military have condemned the assassination, calling it a violation of the ceasefire and international law. However, Prime Minister Nawaf Salam has remained silent, which is not surprising given his dependence on the West. The silence of the Prime Minister reflects the government's inability to protect Lebanon's sovereignty and independence. If Hezbollah decides to retaliate, it could lead to a full-scale war. Israel's air defenses in northern Palestine are now on high alert, and they've moved armored vehicles and tanks to the northern border. Hezbollah must prepare not only to strike back, but also to brace for the serious consequences that will follow, which could include a heavy attack on Israeli infrastructure. This will be a major challenge for Hezbollah, as retaliation won't be a simple back and forth, but will lead to a large-scale military conflict. The situation will also involve the Lebanese military, which may be dragged into the conflict if Israel launches an invasion. However, an invasion of southern Lebanon by Israel will be difficult, as Hezbollah has built a solid defensive infrastructure there, including tunnels and secret military facilities. Moreover, the Lebanese military has been deployed to the south to bolster defenses. Although Western powers, particularly the United States, have historically intervened in Lebanese politics and the region, the current situation shows a significant shift. The U.S. and its allies no longer have complete control over the situation in Lebanon, especially with Israel's increasing tensions with Western countries. Hezbollah faces a life-or-death decision, and its response will not be just a military action but a strong message to international powers. Internationally, a full-scale war in Lebanon will not only affect the region, but will also likely involve other countries, like Syria, Iran, and Russia. These military actions could escalate tensions and result in a broader conflict. Meanwhile, the West might seek to instigate wars elsewhere, such as in Venezuela, to distract from the Middle East and reduce the possibility of Russian and Iranian involvement in these conflicts. It's important to consider that Israel has previously violated the sovereignty of other countries, such as Iraq, using its airspace for airstrikes and military operations against Iranian targets. This highlights Israel's disregard for regional sovereignty and its ongoing strategy to weaken Iran and its allies. Looking at the political situation in other countries, like Brazil and Colombia, we see a shift in how these countries approach Palestine. While they may publicly express support for Palestine, their close ties with Western powers and Israel remain. This reveals a reality. Even with public support, governments are still pressured by international alliances, particularly the U.S. and Israel. The situation in these countries, particularly the growing hostility toward Venezuela, a nation striving to maintain its independence and sovereignty, shows that not only Middle Eastern nations, but also Latin American countries are facing challenges from imperialist powers and their proxies. In conclusion, all these events reveal a broader strategy by Western powers to initiate a full-scale war. Smaller countries and resistance groups like Hezbollah are continuing to fight to protect their sovereignty and freedom while also standing up against imperialist forces. This is not just about Lebanon, but a larger geopolitical struggle where major powers like Russia, Iran, and others are directly challenging Western hegemony.